Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Inshallah, today we'll begin chapter 3 in our biology class. Here we talk about communities. When we say communities, we here mean, of course, community of living things. And community, if you recall, was a collection, different population of organisms living in a certain area. So this is how we had categorized, so to speak, living things and their environment. First, you can study, as we said, in the living thing at an individual level, then on a population level, then at a community level, where communities are populations of different groups of animals, and at an ecosystem level, where an ecosystem is a community plus its abiotic factors. And different ecosystems in similar geographic areas constitute a biome, and all the biomes of the earth combined together gives the biosphere. So we shall briefly talk about life in communities, or what sort of conditions need to exist for communities to thrive, because clearly in certain parts of the world, such as a desert, you don't see the vibrant living communities of organisms that you would see in certain other parts of the earth, right? So we understand then that there are limiting factors. In other words, there are factors that restrict the numbers and reproduction or distribution of organisms in a particular area. These factors are either biotic or abiotic factors. So there are certain things that limit growth of communities within a geographic area, and that's a good thing, because otherwise we would have rabbits running wild, across the neighborhood, right? Traffic jam because of rabbits, right? But that doesn't happen. How come it doesn't happen if rabbits multiply like crazy? Because there are limiting factors. Now, what are these limiting factors, you wonder? Well, some common limiting factors are simple as sunlight. Now, you have to understand plants are obviously important living things, and certain plants grow in certain geographic areas because of the amount of sunlight that they need and the amount of sunlight that nourishes, so to speak, the plants in certain areas. So sunlight and climate are some very important limiting factors. Temperature of the area also is very important. The living things that you find in the Arctic pole, for example, are particularly suited to that temperature, but not nearly as numerous, for example, as you'd find in the equatorial areas. The amount of water available for those living things, the amount of nutrients, the amount of food available, right? Also, things like fire, if there are frequent fires, etc. The soil quality, of course, will limit the growth of certain plants. The chemistry of the soil and the space available for living things to occupy, and also other organisms. So other organisms, of course, are limiting factors too. One of the reasons why rabbits don't go wild is because their predators are very close by, keeping their population in check. This is an interesting picture. This was I found fascinating. Anyway, see, as you go from towards the equator, towards the North Pole, you see a change in, of course, the climate, right? You also see a change in different types of trees you find, and tropical rainforest, the temperate deciduous forest, and then you see like the evergreens, and then you see, right, the same. So this is a change in the environment as you go from equator to the North Pole. The same change, believe it or not, occurs as we climb up altitude. For example, in any area, if you climb up the mountains, the higher the mountain you go up, the environment reflects the same changes as you would occur if you were climbing towards the North Pole, so to speak. In other words, the higher the altitude is very similar to the higher you are, the closer you are towards the poles. So which is an interesting phenomenon. Now, also speaking about limiting factors and tolerance, okay? All living things, see, they need to have a certain cozy zone to survive. In other words, they have a certain tolerance for any particular fluctuation in biotic or abiotic factors in the environment. In other words, we like certain cozy temperatures. If extremely hot in an environment, human beings won't do very good. If it's extremely cold environment, the human beings don't do very good either. So that's why, they're not thriving communities, metropolitan areas at the North or South Poles, because it's just, we don't live in that extremes of environment. We don't find it particularly comfortable. So we have a tolerancy, and this is an important concept to understand. Watch. So for any living thing, there is optimum range for anything. In other words, they're happy over here in this range of the parameters. Outside this optimal range, this is called zone of stress. I mean, they're okay over here. They'd rather be over here, but they're okay. They can handle it. Outside of this, they're not happy. I mean, they begin to die. Okay, so this is called a certain tolerance organisms have. So in the optimum range, the organisms are abundant. They grow very well. And then as outside this optimum range, in the zones of stress, the population, the number of organisms begins to decline. And after a while, it gets really, really bad and they begin to die. Okay? That's true for all living things. So, and if you look at this beautiful picture over here, you see, it's so aesthetically appealing, right? It is one of the reasons it is like that because there's a harmonious relationship between all living things that are in this environment. They interact and they are able to maintain certain tolerability, and they kind of are limiting factors for each other. Okay. The other question is, how did this beautiful forest come about? Okay, how did this all come about? From the time when the earth was like, barren rock, molten rocks, and how did this all happen, right? Okay, so if you recall from the history of Earth, Earth started as a very fireball. There was no life. It's all rock and molten lava. Okay, so the evolution of life and living things in any particular area, this is called succession. Succession, or which the literal word implying it changes over time. So any particular geographic area undergoes a succession of changes. Okay, so and there are two types of changes that occur. One's called primary succession, and the second is called a secondary succession. Okay, this is the best example I can suggest to you is like Hawaiian Islands. Okay, Hawaiian Islands, everybody wants to go visit them, right? Hawaiian Islands are a result of volcanic eruptions under the ocean. So these volcanic eruptions occurred on the ocean, and they spewed out a whole bunch of lava, which eventually, when they cooled down, they became bare or barren rock. There was nothing on it. There was not a single life form there. Okay, but if you go to Hawaii now, people don't go to Hawaii because it's barren rock. You go to Hawaii because it's beautiful, gorgeous, it's verdant, it has exceptional life, and looks very beautiful. Okay, so how did it go from barren rock in the middle of the ocean to a beautiful island full of life and vigor, right? How did that happen? Well, it's a very beautiful process, actually, and it's a very slow process that occurs over hundreds of years. Okay, not necessarily millions of years, but hundreds of years. Okay, so the first thing that happens is because they're in water, lichens, etc., they come and colonize these rocks. Okay. And then after a while, these lichens start to form and make tiny plants and small annual plants and lichens. The community looks like this. After some more decades, there's some small perennial herbs and grasses begin to form like that, right? And then after that, and some more decades and pass, etc., hundreds of years pass, some grasses and shrubs, and shade-intolerant trees and small trees like this grow, okay? And after this stage, we reach what's called a climax community. Okay, shade-tolerant trees. In other words, little baby trees can be under big trees type of things. So there are different types. Now, if you look at this picture, Hawaii, if you go to Hawaii, for example, you might see this climax community. You would never think in your life that at one time it looked like this. But it had to actually go through this stage to get to this stage, which is quite interesting. You would never think that it has actually gone to these various stages, and that at different stages the place looked very, very different. Nevertheless, the final community, the climax community that evolves there, that final community is called the climax community. So going from barren rock all the way up to the climax community, this is called primary succession, or primary meaning from beginning, okay, from the beginning succession of changes in life forms in the area, reaching up to the climax community. Does that make sense? Now, how does this happen, okay? The reason, see, you can't take a barren rock like this and plant a big, huge tree over here. You know, how's it going to do that? There's no soil there. It's all rock, guys, right? See, the bigger a bigger tree is, the bigger roots it must have, okay? Now, if you think about it, okay, and nearly half the tree is underground over here, okay? Half the trees over there, half the trees underground, so to speak, right? Now, why do trees have roots? Trees don't have, well, of course, they need the roots to stand tall. But they're not just putting the roots in just to stand tall. They're putting the roots in to dig in then for nutrients, etc., right? So trees need to have a certain amount of soil, okay? They have to have soil, okay, in order for them to grow that tall. If you take a tree and dig a big hole in a rock and plant a hole in a rock and put a tree there, it ain't going to work. That tree's not going to survive. It's going to die. To have a tree, you must have soil. See, this process takes so long. The reason it takes so long is because if you look over here, there's no soil. And over time, see, the rocks begin to crumble into small pieces, and then small pieces, and small pieces, and smaller pieces. And as the roots grow in there, they break up the rocks into smaller and smaller pieces. The process takes long because it takes long to make soil. Okay? So this is what's really happening at the time. You start out with bare rock, and as you can see over here, as time goes by, okay, there's more and more soilets over there until the soil is able to support the climax community. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So this is called primary succession, starting from bare rock and reaching to climax community. The interesting thing about this process is nearly always, it's almost the same everywhere you go. Any part of the earth, so it's the same process that occurs. The first species to come and inhabit this area, they're called pioneer species, and then the intermediate species, and then the climax community. Now, succession, therefore, we said, is divided into primary type, like we described to you in Hawaii. Then there is secondary succession. See, what happens if, for example, if a climax community has a wildfire? This happens like in California all the time. You get fires all the time, poor Californians, okay? A huge fire goes to the whole forest and destroys all the beautiful climax community that had existed. What happens then? Well, it's not going to always stay dead, right? Obviously, it's going to become very vibrant and alive again. So this process where you had previously established the primary climax community and then subsequently erased it for one reason or another, and then you're starting over again, this is called secondary succession. Makes sense, right? Now, you would conjecture that it would take longer or shorter to have for the species to come back in a secondary succession. Shorter. Very good. Why? Because the key element, the key ingredient, soil, is already present. The soil is there. If anything, all the burnt ember, all that stuff gives you more soil, makes the soil more richer, if anything, right? So the difference between primary and secondary succession is that primary succession begins with no life there, okay? There's no soil there. There's soil already present. This is a new area of volcanic ash, old area, okay? So that's the key difference. So here's an example of a secondary succession. See, the fire burns it. Look at the soil that's there already. See, look at the soil that's over here. So secondary succession is much faster. Now, the interesting thing about this over here, okay, what's interesting about this is I like you to see, it still goes through the same stages. See, the climax community was destroyed, but it doesn't return straight to the climax community. It goes through the same stages, but at a faster rate. I don't know about you, but I find that kind of cool, kind of interesting aspect of the way that nature works. It's because uh, of the nature of the organ plants. So this is example of a secondary succession climax community destroyed. And again, even this cartoon picture shows you how the climax community is eventually reached. The same climax community is eventually reached, but it's going through these various stages that have to go through. Okay? So that is the first part of our chapter. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each biomes in brief detail, inshallah, after a brief pause, inshallah. Until next time then, assalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Assalamu alaikum.